Hello and welcome back to another Warcraft video. This time it is going to be about High Elves and the Warlords of Draenor. So this is really about them being a new race in the game, and first of all, I do not think that these guys will make it in. Personally, I think they're too close to Blood Elves, and essentially the only difference between them and Blood Elves is they have different coloured eyes, which really, from a gameplay and game design perspective, it doesn't really make much sense. If the Horde were to get a new kind of really cool race and the Alliance just got a copy of Blood Elves, I don't think it would go down that well. So yeah, just between that and a few other things, I don't think these guys are very likely. Now, they are definitely an interesting race, that's for sure, that if it was added to the Alliance, there would be good lore to it. I'm just not convinced that would translate into anything particularly compelling in terms of just like gameplay and interestingness and stuff like that, because at the end of the day, we have had elves in the game for a long time, and yeah, I just don't think they're different enough from Blood Elves. Like, they are essentially nearly the same as Blood Elves when you actually come into the lore, and I will cover the lore in a minute. But first, let's talk about in-game. Well, unlike the other race videos, there's not a massive amount to say here because we already know what these guys can do, because High Elves are, for all intents and purposes, Blood Elves, just with, well, they still have the same hunger for magical power, but the difference is that they don't resort to siphoning it from other living creatures. So I suppose they're a little bit more they're quite honorable there. They are definitely come under the sort of thing as being an alliance race, I guess. Now, Blood Elves can be hunters, mages, paladins, rogues, warlocks, warriors, priests, death knights, and monks. So I'd assume that High Elves could be the same. In terms of these guys actually coming to the game, I think it could be introduced via Lyria returning, and then maybe meeting up with her sister, because in Dalaran with the Silver Covenant, that's where most of the High Elves are at the minute. So yeah, overall that's just kind of what I think and what they'd be like in-game. Now let's jump into the lore. So, while they're not that powerful now, the elves, the High Elves, used to be a very powerful force on the continent of the Eastern Kingdoms. Now, their history does go back a very, very long way. So, as we know, most of the Night Elf population adopted Druidism, and they outlawed magic because the events of the Well of Eternity and stuff like that, it ended up bringing demons to the world, and at the end of the day, they couldn't have that going on, so they had to outlaw it, and it was punishable by death. They believed that the lust of power for magic was corrupting and a danger to the world. So after the Shattering, for a lot of the elves who have followed Queen Ashara, known as the Highborn, their source of magical power was gone, and they started to feel a withdrawal. And after an argument with the Druid leadership, they created magical storms in Ashen Vale, essentially to spite the Druids, and this was punishable by death, but Malfurion and the Druids couldn't bring themselves to slaughter so many of their people, so they were exiled across the water to the Eastern Kingdoms. Of course, where they didn't have a power source to use, I guess. Now, anyway, they initially settled in the Terrasfall Glades, but many of them who did were driven mad, and it's speculated that there's something very evil under the Glades, and Blizzard actually has not told us. They've more told us that it's just a plot device that they can pick up at some point. The time away from the source of their power caused their skin tone to become a little bit more peachy and their height to decrease, so they essentially looked a little bit more like a mix of a human and a night elf, instead of just the night elf with their sort of bluish purpley skin. They were in contact with the early humans, but they didn't really pay much heed to them, as the main problem was the Ammonite trolls, who were by far the greatest threat. The trolls are a very old race, and at this stage they were, I suppose, at the height of their power, because in recent times the players have really suppressed the trolls quite a lot. Now, after quite a while, they ended up founding Kel'Thalas in the north of the Eastern Kingdoms, and unknowingly this was actually on an ancient troll site, which caused them to come under constant attack by the trolls, and the elves were able to win the war because of their use of magic. While their source of power was diminished with the Well of Eternity being destroyed, they still did have mastery of magic. Now, after this, they shielded the city so that they could practice their magic theoretically without attracting the Burning Legion. They did this via a whole bunch of runestones that are, I suppose, just located amongst the kingdom of Kel'Thalas. Now, eventually they did create the Sun Well, which is essentially a smaller and weaker version of the Well of Eternity, and it's the power source for their people, and also powers a lot of the magical things in Kel'Thalas. If you actually go there in game, you'll see a lot of cool buildings twisting around and just general things which have lots of magic imbued into them. Now, over the next few thousand years, not much happened bar the Troll Wars, which they were very large and very bloody, and the elves and Arthur humans ended up fighting off the Ammonite. Now, around this time, they also started developing good relations with the Wildhammers, and this was one of the catalysts for the War of the Three Hammers. But eventually, after some of these things happened, and before the main wars, they weren't, I suppose, part of a bespoke alliance, but they would team up with the alliance races when it was convenient. So for an example, in the Second War, when the orcs were actually getting quite close to Kel'Thuzad, the elves decided to chip in and help out. And while this did really help the alliance defeat the orcs, one issue is that a lot of their land was burnt, a lot of the outskirts of the land was burnt, and they decided that the alliance weren't really the best at commanding their armies, because they didn't do a great job. So they, in a way, sort of, they mostly withdrew their support. Now, some of them didn't, those mainly being Lyria and her rangers, who stayed loyal to the alliance, but of course they are now lost beyond the Dark Portal, hopefully to return in the next expansion. Now, later on in the Third War, Kel'Thuzad was utterly destroyed by Arthas, with the vast majority of the population being slaughtered and risen as the undead. Those who survived either were in hiding or had fled to Dalaran. Dalaran, of course, was also destroyed, but still it led to more of them surviving. Now, after all of this, Kel'Thuzad decided to start gathering the survivors and rebuilding Silvermoon, and in the end the majority of the elves joined him. Now, due to very unreasonable commands from Garithos, this is in Warcraft 3, Kel'Thuzad ended up allying with the Naga to get the job done, which of course was a very punishable by death thing, and because of this he ended up fleeing to Outland. The remaining Blood Elves are the playable race that we see in the game today. They were cut off from the Sunwell, so what they decided to do was start to siphon power from other creatures, and some of the population were disgusted by this practice, so they were exiled by Lorthamar, and the exiles are what are currently known as the High Elves, and that's essentially the in-game race. Lore-wise, as you can see, they are the exact same as the Blood Elves up until the last sentence or two. Because they are the same race, they are really just two different factions. Of course they, I suppose, are on opposing sides since Dalaran is now with the Alliance, but lore-wise, all that happened is the High Elves were not prepared to siphon magical power for energy. So that's really it for the High Elf lore. I don't think these guys are going to come into the game for all the different reasons I've said above. It's funny, I'd like them to be in the game from a perspective of, I think it would be pretty cool to play an elf, and I think they look they can look cool. I'm not too keen. It seems really like chauvinistic saying I'm not too keen in the male model, but I think the female models are pretty cool. I think if there was like a more reasonable version of both models, so perhaps if the male model didn't look so much like, I don't know, like some sort of Hollister model or something, then it would be better if the female model didn't look just so ridiculously thin. Like if they actually look like proper models, but still they carried a lot of the art design with just like some of the, the sort of elvish design that makes them look cool, then it would carry on. I think Blood Elves look too much like they stepped out of some sort of catwalk, and that's one of the reasons why I don't really like Blood Elves in the game. But anyway, hey, it could be an interesting race. I just don't think it'll happen. Personally, I want Ethereals to appear because freaking Ethereals look amazing and I love space. But at the end of the day, doesn't matter if I want it or not, probably doesn't really have that much of an effect on the chances of it being in the game. Anyway, enough rambling, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.